He loved the way people looked at him when he walked into a room. That was the thing about Marcus, not Marcus from the file, a different one, the one she had married. No, his name was Holden Dre, and the way Holden moved through the world, you would think the world had been built specifically to frame him. Adrienne had noticed that about him long before she married him. She had thought it was confidence. It took her 4 years to understand it was something else entirely. Not confidence. Hunger. A specific kind of hunger that only other people's attention could feed. She was 34 years old, standing in the doorway of their master bathroom, watching him fix his tie in the mirror. He had not looked at her once, not when she walked in, not when she said his name. He was focused entirely on his own reflection, adjusting the silver clip at his collar with the careful precision of a man who considered himself a work of art. Holden. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. He made a small sound, not a word, just an acknowledgement that sound had occurred somewhere in the vicinity. The Aldrin group dinner is tonight, she said. I thought we were going together. He reached for his jacket. I told you last week, I'm taking Petra. A pause, not for her reaction, just for the jacket sleeve. She's better for this kind of event. The partners expect a certain image. Adrienne stood very still. Petra Nast was 26. She worked in Holden's firm's marketing division, and she had been better for this kind of event 3 times in the past 2 months. The charity auction in April, the rooftop launch in May, now the Aldrin dinner. I'm your wife, now, Adrienne said. He turned then. He looked at her the way you look at a wall you've bumped into, mildly irritated, not particularly interested in understanding why it was there. You know how these things work, he said. It's optics. You're a small exhale, like he was choosing the diplomatic version. You're more of a behind-the-scenes person, Adrienne. That's not an insult. It's just true. She had nothing to say to that. Or she had too much. Either way, the words stayed locked behind her teeth, and he walked past her, picked up his keys from the dresser, and left. The door didn't slam. That would have required him to feel something. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after. The room still held the faint smell of his cologne, something expensive and deliberately chosen, and she sat in it like a woman who had fallen into water and was only now beginning to notice she was wet. Behind the scenes. She turned the phrase over in her mind the way you turn a stone, looking for something underneath. But there was nothing underneath except more of the same. 4 years of more of the same. She had not always been this, she knew that. There had been a version of Adrienne Solis before Holden, before this house, before she had learned to make herself smaller, in rooms where she used to take up space without thinking about it. That Adrienne had run a non-profit legal aid organization, the Solis Access Project, that provided free representation to low-income families in housing disputes. She had built it from a folding table in a shared office with 2 volunteers and a donated laptop. By the time she married Holden, it had a staff of 11 and had helped reclaim wrongful evictions for over 400 families in 3 years. She had stepped back from the day-to-day operations when Holden suggested it. You can still be involved, he'd said. But we're building something here, Adrienne. My firm, our life, it needs your attention too. She had thought that was partnership. She had thought that was love. She stood up and walked to the mirror. The woman looking back at her looked tired, not ugly, not broken, just worn at the edges in the particular way that happens when you spend years dimming yourself to not outshine someone who never deserved the spotlight to begin with. She looked at herself for a long time. She thought about how Holden had described her, behind the scenes, more of a background person, said it so casually, like it was a known fact about her, like it was something she had always been. She raised her hand and pressed her fingers against the cool glass. That's not who you are, she said quietly. The words felt strange out loud, awkward, like speaking a language you studied in college and haven't used since. She said it again and again until the strangeness wore off and what was left was just the truth of it, sitting there plainly. She picked up her phone. She scrolled past names she hadn't called in months, past the Solis Access Project group thread she had muted without meaning to, past everything she had quietly deprioritized in the business of being Holden's wife. She stopped on a name, Grant Okafor, not the Grant from the list, a completely different person. A man who had been her family's attorney for years before she'd ever met Holden, who had watched her build the Solace project from nothing and told her once, at a fundraiser when she'd been second-guessing herself, "You're the most underestimated person in this room, and the only one who doesn't know it," she called. He picked up on the second ring. "Adrienne." His voice was warm, unhurried. She exhaled. "I know. I'm sorry." She paused. Holden's filing for divorce, a beat of silence, not the silence of shock, the silence of a man choosing his words carefully, because he understands the weight of the moment. "Are you safe?" "Yes, yes." She almost laughed. "Yes, I'm physically fine." She pressed her fingers to her forehead. "He left tonight with someone else." He said, "I'm a behind-the-scenes person." He said, "I don't match the image." Grant was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was steady. "Adrienne, I've watched you stand in front of a city council meeting and dismantle a corrupt housing policy in 22 minutes. You are not behind anything. You are the front." She closed her eyes. "There's an event tonight," he said. "The Aldrin Group recognition dinner. I know that's where he went. And I know you know people in that room. Real people, not borrowed ones." A pause. "Come. Not for him. Not for any of them. Come because you've spent 4 years making yourself invisible, and I think you've forgotten that when you walk into a room, people notice." She was quiet for a long time. "Grant, I'll be at the entrance," he said simply. "I'll wait." She set the phone down slowly. The house was very quiet. It had always been quiet in a way she had told herself was peaceful. She could see now that it wasn't peaceful. It was the quiet of a place that had never been fully inhabited. A house where one person was always waiting and the other never arrived. She stood up and walked to her closet. She moved through things slowly. Her fingers passed over dress after dress, each one sensible, each one chosen at some point in the past 4 years with some variation of the same thought. Will this embarrass him? Will this draw too much attention? Is this appropriate for his world? Then she found it, pushed to the very back, still in its garment bag, never worn. A deep burgundy gown with a structured bodice and a skirt that swept the floor like something out of a painting. She had bought it 2 years ago on a quiet Saturday when she'd been alone in the city, and she had seen it in a shop window and walked in and tried it on and thought, maybe someday there will be an occasion. She unzipped the bag. The color hit her first. Deep, saturated, unapologetic. Not a color that asked permission. She put it on. The fit was extraordinary. The way things are when they were meant for a specific version of you that has been waiting patiently in the background. It moved with her when she moved. It didn't need her to hold her breath or stand a certain way. It just fit. The way the truth fits once you stop arguing with it. She stood in front of the mirror. She did her makeup deliberately. Not quickly, not anxiously, deliberately. She'd been good at this once, before she'd started rushing through it. Before it had become something she did around Holden's schedule. She took her time with it now, dark liner. A wine-colored lip that matched the gown almost exactly. Her hair pinned low and loose, the way she wore it before she'd learned what style Holden preferred. She reached into her jewelry box. At the very bottom, under the tasteful pearls and the delicate chains he had given her at various anniversaries, was a bracelet. Hammered gold, wide and substantial, bought with the first real donation the Solace Project had ever received, a $400 check from a retired schoolteacher in Ohio who had read about the organization in a local newsletter. Adrienne had taken $40 of her own money, matched it, and bought the bracelet as a reminder. She had not worn it in 3 years. She put it on. She looked at the woman in the mirror for a long moment. She didn't recognize her, not because the woman was a stranger, but because she was familiar in a way Adrienne had stopped letting herself be. This was not a performance. This was not armor. This was just her, returned. She called her driver, and her voice did not shake when she spoke. The Aldrin Group dinner was held at the Westport Grand, a venue with floor-to-soiling windows and a lobby that echoed every footstep like it was announcing you. Adrienne had been there before, years ago, at an event for a housing advocacy coalition. She had spoken on a panel that night. She had gotten a standing ovation. Holden had not been there. She had gone alone, and she had been enough. Grant was standing exactly where he said he would be. He saw her before she reached the doors, and he stopped at conversation with the person beside him. He simply stopped. His eyes moved from her face to the gown to her face again, and she shook his head slowly, the way people do when they're struck by something and words are too slow. Adrienne Solis, he said quietly, and the way he said it, her name, her actual name, not Mrs. Dre, not Holden's wife, not the woman in the background. It landed in her chest, like something coming home. She smiled. It was a real smile, not a practiced one, not the one she'd learned to produce at Holden's events. It reached her eyes without effort. They walked in together. The room was everything the Aldrin dinner always was. Deep mahogany and candlelight. The kind of crowd that knew each other's names, but not always their stories. Laughter that was sometimes real and sometimes not. A string quartet in the corner. Waitstaff moving through the room like current in a river. And then, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. The music didn't stop. But there were pauses. The kind that happen in rooms full of perceptive people when something in the atmosphere changes. Heads turned. Conversations dropped half a beat. Eyes followed the woman in deep burgundy who walked like she had decided, somewhere between the parking structure and the front door, that she had been standing in the wings long enough. She was not performing confidence. She simply was not hiding anymore. There is a difference, and people in rooms like this one can feel it. Across the ballroom, Holden stood near the bar. Petra was beside him, laughing at something, her hand on his arm. He was scanning the room the way he always did, looking to see who had noticed him. He noticed Adrienne instead. The glass stopped moving toward his mouth. Something crossed his face. It happened in the space of a second, a sequence of realizations, arriving faster than he could manage them. That was his wife. That was the woman he had called a background person not 3 hours ago. That was the woman he had left at home. And she was standing across the ballroom in a burgundy gown that he had never seen, and every person in her immediate vicinity had turned to look at her, and she was not looking at him at all. Petra followed his gaze. She was quiet for a moment, studying Adrienne from across the room. Then she said softly, almost to herself, "Who is that?" "That's Adrienne," Holden said. His voice was flat in a way that wasn't composure. It was shock wearing composure as a costume. "Your wife?" He didn't answer. Petra looked at Adrienne. She looked at the room around her, at the way eyes had followed her in, at the way she moved through the crowd with Grant Okafor beside her, unhurried, complete. Then Petra looked at Holden, and something in her expression changed. Not jealousy, calculation. The quiet arithmetic of a woman reassessing the person she thought she understood. Adrienne moved through the room without looking for him. She stopped to speak with Thomas Aldrin, the group's founder, who had known her work with the Solis Project for years and greeted her with both hands. She laughed at something he said, genuinely, fully, and Holden from across the room watched his wife be recognized by the most important person in the building. She had not needed him to get here. She had never needed him for this. He knew that now. He had always known it. Somewhere beneath all the careful arrangements he had made to keep her from shining in rooms where he wanted to be the light. He had called it practicality. He had called it image management. He had told himself she was happier this way, quieter, less stressed, freed from the pressure of her ambitions. But watching her now, he understood what he had actually done. Grant touched her arm lightly and leaned close to say something. She tilted her head to listen, and when she looked up at him, there was an ease between them that Holden recognized, not because he had seen it in their marriage, but because he had never seen it in their marriage. That was the difference. They were near enough now that Holden could hear fragments of conversation. He had drifted closer without fully deciding to, the way you walk towards something even when you know you shouldn't. Adrienne saw him. She did not look away. She did not drop her gaze or set her jaw or let anything in her expression tighten. She simply looked at him the way you look at someone who used to have a great deal of power over you and no longer does. "Holden," she said, calm, unhurried, like she was greeting a former colleague she wished no harm. He opened his mouth. "My attorney reached out this afternoon," she said, before he could form whatever he was reaching for. "You'll have the preliminary filing by the end of the week. There's no rush on your end. Take the time you need." He stared at her. "I hope the dinner goes well," she said, and she meant it. There was no venom in it, no performance of graciousness. She simply meant it, because she no longer had anything left to be angry about. The anger had burned off somewhere in the space between the bedroom mirror and this ballroom, and what was left underneath it was just clarity. She turned back to Grant, and Grant, who had been quiet during this, who had let her handle it entirely on her own because he understood that it was hers to handle, looked at her with something in his expression that had been building for years, and that he had kept carefully to himself because the timing had never been right. It was right now. "Can I say something?" he said. Not a question, exactly. More like a man who has decided he is done waiting for a better moment, because there might not be one. "Yes," she said. "I have had a great deal of respect for you for a very long time," he said, his voice quiet and level. Around them the conversation continued, but the small circle they stood in had gone still. "I've watched you do extraordinary work. I've watched you give enormous amounts of yourself to things that mattered. And I've watched someone take that for granted in a way that I have never been able to make sense of." He paused. "I don't want to be another person standing at a distance, watching you be remarkable. I'd rather be the person beside you, if that's something you'd want." The room around them felt charged. Not in a theatrical way, in the way that real moments do. The kind that don't announce themselves, that just arrive and settle, and everyone in the vicinity can feel that something true has just been said. Holden felt it. He was standing close enough to feel it, and it was one of the worst feelings of his life. Not because someone else wanted his wife, but because he understood, watching them, what it looked like when a man actually saw someone, when he hadn't been looking. When he had been too busy arranging his own reflection to notice the person standing next to him. Adrienne looked at Grant for a long moment. "I think," she said slowly, "I'd like that. Yes." She took his arm, and they walked away, walked toward Thomas Aldrin's table, toward a conversation about the Social Project's new expansion, toward a room full of people who were glad to see her. Holden stood where they had left him. Petra appeared at his elbow a few minutes later. She was quiet for a moment, watching the same thing he was watching. Adrienne laughing, Adrienne at ease, Adrienne in a room where she clearly and completely belonged. Then Petra reached into her clutch and pressed a folded card into his hand. She picked up her bag from the chair beside him. She didn't say anything. She just walked away toward the coat check, toward the exit, toward somewhere he wasn't. He opened the card. Her handwriting was small and precise. It read, "I thought you were impressive. I see now that I was watching the wrong person. Don't call me." He stood in the middle of the Westport Grand with a card in his hand and an empty space on both sides of him, while the room moved around him like water, around a stone, indifferent, unbothered, entirely uninterested in his particular stillness. He walked out alone. The divorce took 6 weeks. No contested assets, no dramatic proceedings, just 2 attorneys and a series of documents, and a life being carefully unmade from the architecture up. Adrienne kept the apartment she had bought before the marriage. Holden kept the house they had shared. She signed her half over without negotiation. She didn't need it. She had a Solus Project board meeting the following Tuesday, and a call with a city councilwoman about funding expansion the week after that. She had things to do. She had always had things to do. She had simply been too busy managing his life to remember it. Grant called 2 days after the divorce was finalized. Not about the case. There was no case anymore. He called to ask if she wanted to have dinner. She said yes. They took their time about it. Dinner became a walk, became a long conversation on a park bench in November, with coffee getting cold in their hands. He wasn't in a hurry, and neither was she, and there was something deeply peaceful about that after years of a marriage that had felt like constantly running to keep up with something that was never going to slow down for her. She introduced him to her team at the Solus Project in December. He already knew some of them by name. She had talked about them often, in the years before, in passing, in a way she hadn't realized until later meant that this work was the thing she was always thinking about, even when she was trying to think about something else. He proposed the following spring. No grand gesture, no audience. They were in her kitchen, early on a Saturday, and he had made coffee badly, as he always did, and she had laughed at him about it, as she always did. And then he had looked at her across the counter and said, very simply, "I want this to be what every morning looks like. Will you marry me?" She said yes before she had finished the sentence. They married in June, in the courtyard of the community center, where the Solace Project had held its first public event. 11 staff members attended. 462 families had been served since the organization's founding. There was a banner on the wall that someone had made by hand. Holden heard about the wedding the way you hear, about most things you've forfeited, sideways from someone else, with no opportunity to respond or revise or walk back to the moment where things could have gone differently. He heard she looked beautiful. He heard she cried when she said her vows. He heard the organization was expanding into 2 more counties. He sat with that information in the particular silence of a man who had held something extraordinary in his hands, and decided, without looking closely, that it wasn't worth keeping. It was too late for looking closely now. Adrienne Solis had never needed anyone to see her. She had simply needed for one evening to stop agreeing with the people who refused to. After that, there was no going back to small.